Before we begin, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment which city you're watching from. It really helps us keep bringing stories like this one. I need to say something before I tell you what happened. This isn't easy to share. For a long time, I convinced myself that silence was safer than truth, and about the cost of defending what's right when no one believes you. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who should have listened, this story might feel familiar. If you've ever stood alone against a system that seemed designed to crush you, you'll understand why it took me so long to speak. But here's what I learned. Sometimes the only way forward is to refuse to be silent, even when silence feels like the only safe option. Your Honor, I'm telling you the truth. I never signed that document. The judge leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and let out a short, dismissive laugh. It wasn't loud, but in the silence of that courtroom, it echoed like a slap across my face. The sound bounced off the high ceilings, off the wood-paneled walls, off every indifferent face in the gallery behind me. "Mr. Callahan," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "do you understand the seriousness of perjury? Because right now, you're sounding desperate." I felt my chest tighten. My hands gripped the edge of the defendant's table so hard my knuckles turned white. The wood was smooth and cold under my palms. Around me, I could hear the faint shuffle of papers, the low murmur of spectators in the gallery, the creak of the old wooden benches. My lawyer, a public defender named Morris, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, didn't even glance at me. He just stared down at his notepad, his pen frozen mid-sentence, like he'd already given up. "I'm not lying," I said, again, quieter this time, but steady. "That signature isn't mine." The judge exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound of pure irritation. He adjusted his glasses with one hand, a gesture that seemed designed to emphasize just how much of his valuable time I was wasting. "Counsel," he said, turning to Morris with barely concealed impatience, "does your client plan to waste more of this court's time with baseless accusations, or are we going to proceed with the facts?" Morris cleared his throat. His collar looked too tight. "Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence regarding the— Maintaining innocence is one thing. Claiming forgery without evidence is another. Mr. Callahan, you're not helping yourself here." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. The judge had already turned his attention to the prosecutor, a sharp-dressed woman named Vega, who wore her confidence like armor. She stood, smoothing down her blazer with practiced precision, and gave the judge a polite nod. Everything about her posture said she'd already won. Everything about her expression said I was wasting everyone's time. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. The defendant signed a binding contract agreeing to the terms of repayment. He defaulted. Now he's facing the consequences of his own actions. This is not a complex case." "Agreed," the judge said, almost before she'd finished. "Let's move this along." I felt a cold sweat forming on my back. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I wasn't supposed to be here at all. The courtroom itself felt designed to make people like me feel small. The judge sat elevated on his bench, looking down at everyone. The prosecutor's table was organized, professional, stacked with neat folders and color-coded tabs. My side of the room looked makeshift by comparison. A few scattered papers, Morris's worn briefcase, and me wearing the only suit I owned, bought at a discount store 3 years ago for my mother's funeral. That thought hit me like a punch. My mother. This whole nightmare had started because of her. 6 months earlier, I'd been working 2 jobs, one as a night security guard at a warehouse in Trenton, the other doing weekend shifts at a hardware store in Princeton. I wasn't rich, I wasn't even comfortable, but I was making it work. I had a small apartment, a beat-up Honda that ran most of the time, and enough money to cover rent and groceries with a little left over. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Then my mother got sick. Stage 4 lung cancer. The diagnosis came fast, and it came brutal. One day she was complaining about a cough. 2 weeks later, a doctor was telling us she had maybe 6 months if we were lucky. The hospital bills came even faster. Treatments, medications, specialist appointments, things insurance didn't cover or covered so poorly it might as well have been nothing. I watched the numbers pile up on those bills like they were mocking me. $18,000, $32,000, $49,000. I tried everything. I picked up extra shifts, I sold my car and bought a cheaper one, I applied for medical assistance programs, charity funds, payment plans, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. That's when I met Garrett. His office was in a strip mall in Newark, sandwiched between a tax preparation service and a nail salon. The sign outside said Garrett Financial Services, quick loans, fair terms. The inside was clean, professional. Garrett himself was a big man in his 50s with a warm smile and a firm handshake. He wore a polo shirt with the company logo embroidered on the chest. He had business cards. He had framed certifications on the wall. He seemed legitimate. "I understand what you're going through," he'd said, sitting across from me in his office. "Medical debt is no joke, but we're here to help people in situations like yours." He'd offered me a loan, $15,000, 6% interest, reasonable monthly payments. He'd walked me through the numbers on a calculator, showing me how manageable it would be. "All I need is your signature here, here, and here," he'd said, pointing to 3 places on a document. I remembered that moment so clearly now. I'd been exhausted. I'd been desperate. I'd been thinking about my mother lying in a hospital bed, needing medication I couldn't afford. So I signed, or at least I thought I did. But now, sitting in this courtroom, listening to the prosecutor talk about binding contracts and defaulted payments, I realized I'd never actually read that document carefully. I'd skimmed it. I'd trusted Garrett when he explained the terms verbally. And somewhere in that process, something had gone very wrong, because the signature on the contract they were showing the judge wasn't mine. "Mr. Callahan," the judge said, pulling me back to the present, "do you have any actual evidence to support your claim that this signature isn't yours?" I hesitated. I don't have a handwriting expert, if that's what you mean, but I know what my signature looks like. That's not it." The judge's expression hardened, his lips pressed into a thin line. "So you're asking this court to take your word over a notarized document?" "I'm asking the court to look at the document," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Really look at it." Morris shifted beside me. For the first time, he glanced up from his notepad. "Your Honor, if I may—" "You may not," the judge cut him off. "Unless you have something substantive to add, I suggest you let your client speak for himself, though I'm not sure that's helping his case." A few people in the gallery chuckled softly. The sound was low, cruel. My face burned. I could feel the weight of every eye in the room on me. The prosecutor looked bored, tapping her pen against her notepad. The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine without pause, recording every humiliating word. The bailiff stood near the door, expressionless, his hands clasped in front of him. And Morris, my own lawyer, looked like he was already planning his lunch. I was alone. The same way I'd been alone when my mother died. The same way I'd been alone when the bills kept coming even after her funeral. The same way I'd been alone when Garrett stopped returning my calls and started threatening legal action instead. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steadier now, fueled by something I couldn't quite name, anger maybe, or just pure stubbornness. "I'm not trying to waste anyone's time, but something's wrong with that contract. I'm asking you to review it, please." The judge sighed heavily, like I'd just asked him to climb a mountain. He looked at me the way you'd look at a child throwing a tantrum in a grocery store, with exhaustion and faint disgust. "Counsel," he said to Vega, "do you have the original document?" Vega nodded. "We do, Your Honor. It's in the file." "Then let's put this to rest," the judge said. He gestured impatiently toward the clerk. "Bring me the file." The clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on her nose and a cardigan that looked 2 sizes too big, walked over to the prosecutor's table, retrieved a thick manila folder, and carried it up to the judge's bench with both hands. She set it down carefully, like it was something fragile. The judge opened it with one hand, flipping through the pages lazily, like he was skimming a magazine in a waiting room. His expression was bored, impatient. He clearly expected to find nothing. I watched him. My heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone in the room could hear it. My throat was dry, my hands were trembling. He paused. It was subtle. Just a fraction of a second where his eyes stopped moving, where his hand hesitated on the page. His eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned forward just a fraction of an inch and tilted the page toward the light coming from the tall windows behind him. Then he flipped back to an earlier page, then forward again. His finger traced a line of text. The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, the one where you can hear your own breathing. "Counsel," the judge said slowly, his tone completely different now, careful, measured. "Can you approach the bench?" Vega's confident expression flickered just for a moment, but I saw it, a crack in the armor. She stood, walked forward, her heels clicking against the floor, and leaned in as the judge turned the file toward her. Morris, sensing something had shifted, stood as well and moved closer. He looked confused, but also suddenly alert. I couldn't hear what they were saying. The judge's voice was low. Vega was shaking her head, gesturing at something in the file. Morris's eyes went wide, then wider. The conversation lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like an hour. The judge closed the file with a sharp snap and sat back in his chair. For the first time since I'd entered the courtroom, he looked at me. Really looked at me. Not with contempt, not with impatience, with something else, something I couldn't quite read. "Mr. Callahan," he said quietly, "I'm going to need a moment to review this more carefully." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. "Court will recess for 15 minutes, he announced, his voice flat. He stood abruptly, gathered the file under his arm, and disappeared through the door behind the bench. The courtroom erupted into noise. People talking, Morris turning to me, his face pale, the prosecutor gathering her papers with quick, jerky movements. "What the hell did you do?" Morris whispered. "I didn't do anything," I said. "I told you that's not my signature." He stared at me for a long moment, his expression caught between disbelief and something that might have been respect. "We'll see," he said quietly. But I already knew. Something in that file had changed everything. I just didn't know if it was enough to save me. The 15-minute recess stretched into 30, then 40, then 50. I sat at the defendant's table, my hands folded in front of me, trying not to let my mind spiral into worst-case scenarios. But it was hard. Every minute that passed felt like confirmation that I'd been wrong, that whatever the judge had seen wasn't enough, that I was going to lose. Morris had disappeared into a side room with Vega and another man I didn't recognize, probably someone from Garrett's legal team. I could see them through the narrow window in the door. They were talking intensely, gesturing, pointing at documents spread across a table. Every few minutes I'd glance at the door behind the judge's bench, waiting for him to return, but it stayed closed. The spectators in the gallery were getting restless. I could hear whispered conversations, the rustle of coats being adjusted, the scrape of shoes against the floor. A few people had left entirely, apparently deciding whatever drama they'd come to witness wasn't worth the wait. Others had pulled out their phones, scrolling absent-mindedly through social media. One woman in the third row kept staring at me. She was older, maybe 60, with gray hair pulled back in a bun. Her expression wasn't hostile exactly, but it wasn't sympathetic either. It was assessing, like she was trying to figure out if I was guilty or just pathetic. I looked away. I felt like I was underwater. Everything was muffled and slow. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly. The radiator along the far wall clanked and hissed. Outside the tall windows, I could see bare tree branches swaying in the November wind. My mother had died in November, almost exactly a year ago. I remembered sitting in the hospice room with her during her last days. The walls had been painted a soft yellow, like that was supposed to make death feel less terrible. There'd been a window facing a parking lot. She'd stared out that window for hours, not saying much, just watching cars come and go. "I'm sorry," she'd said one afternoon, her voice so quiet I'd almost missed it. "For what?" I'd asked. "For this. For all of it. For being so much trouble." "You're not trouble," I'd said, taking her hand. It had felt so small, so fragile. You're my mom. She smiled faintly. You're a good son, Derek. 3 days later, she was gone. And 2 weeks after that, the first collection notice from Garrett Financial had arrived in the mail. All rise. The bailiff's voice snapped me back to the present. People around me stood quickly, the sound of movement sudden and jarring. I stood too, my legs stiff from sitting. The judge returned, his face unreadable. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. He just sat down, adjusted his glasses, and opened the file again. This time he handled it more carefully, like it contained something fragile or dangerous. Be seated, he said. The room settled into tense silence. I sat. Morris returned to his seat beside me, his expression tight. Vega sat at the prosecutor's table, her posture rigid. The judge folded his hands on top of the file and leaned forward slightly. The light from the windows behind him cast his face partly in shadow. Counsel, he said, his voice measured, I've reviewed the documents in question, and I have concerns. Vega stood quickly. Your Honor, if I may. You may not, he said sharply, cutting her off mid-sentence. You'll have your turn. Right now, I'm addressing the defendant. He looked directly at me. His expression was still serious, but the arrogance was gone. In its place was something I couldn't quite name. Caution, maybe, or discomfort, or both.
Mr. Callahan, he said, you stated that the signature on the loan agreement is not yours. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. And you claim you never signed this document. That's correct. He nodded slowly. I want to be very clear with you. Forgery is a serious allegation. If you're making this claim, you need to be prepared to stand by it. Do you understand? I do, I said, and I'm telling you the truth. I never signed that contract. The judge glanced down at the file, then back at me. The document in question bears a notary seal. It's dated, witnessed, and filed with the county clerk's office. On its face, it appears entirely legitimate. My stomach dropped. Here it comes, I thought, the dismissal, the ruling against me, the end. However, he continued, and I felt a flicker of hope, fragile as a candle flame in wind, there is a notation in the file that was not included in the initial summary provided to this court, a notation that raises significant questions. Vega's jaw tightened. Morris, who had been staring at his notepad, suddenly looked up, alert. What kind of notation, Your Honor? Morris asked. The judge hesitated. He looked down at the file, then back up at the courtroom, as if weighing how much to say. Then he took a slow breath and spoke. The notary, who allegedly witnessed Mr. Callahan's signature on this document, he said carefully, had their license revoked by the state of New Jersey 2 years before this contract was signed. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the gallery buzzed with sudden energy, like someone had flipped a switch. People leaned forward. Someone said, "No way." Another voice said, "Are you serious?" Vega's face went pale. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She looked down at her notes, then back at the judge, clearly scrambling for a response. Morris's mouth fell open. He turned to look at me, his eyes wide, and for the first time since we'd met, I saw something like respect in his expression. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Not in a bad way, in a way that made everything feel suddenly, impossibly light.
"Your Honor," Vega said quickly, her voice tight, "we were not aware of—" "Clearly," the judge interrupted, his voice hard, "because if you had been, I doubt this case would have made it to my courtroom." He turned back to me, his expression serious but no longer dismissive. "Mr. Callahan, did you know the notary personally?" "No, Your Honor," I said, my voice shaking. "I never met a notary. I never signed anything in front of one." The judge nodded slowly. "That's what I suspected." He paused, running a hand over his face, then looked at Vega. "Counsel, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I expect an honest answer. Did your client verify the authenticity of this notarization before bringing this case? Vega opened her mouth, closed it, then said quietly, "We relied on the documentation provided by Garrett Financial Services, Your Honor." "That's not what I asked," the judge said, his voice cold. "Did you verify it?" "No, Your Honor," she admitted. "We did not." The judge's expression darkened. He closed the file with a sharp snap, the sound echoing through the courtroom like a gavel strike. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice firm. "This case is going to be continued pending a full investigation into the authenticity of this document. The prosecutor's office will cooperate fully with that investigation. And Mr. Callahan," he looked directly at me, "you are not to leave the state until this matter is resolved. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor." He looked at Vega. "Counsel, I strongly suggest you review your client's practices. If this document is fraudulent, and right now it certainly appears to be, someone is going to answer for it. And I can promise you, this court does not take kindly to fraud." Vega nodded stiffly, her face still pale. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge stood. "This court is adjourned." The bailiff called out, and the judge disappeared through the door again, taking the file with him. Around me, the courtroom exploded into noise. People talking, moving, gathering their things. The woman in the third row was staring at me again, but this time her expression had changed. Now she looked almost impressed. Morris was gathering his papers, shaking his head in disbelief. He looked at me and let out a short, incredulous laugh. "I don't know how you knew, but you just saved yourself."
I didn't respond. I couldn't, because I hadn't known, not really. I'd just known something was wrong, and I'd refused to let them ignore it. But as the adrenaline started to fade, another feeling crept in. Relief, yes, but also exhaustion and anger, because none of this should have happened in the first place. I shouldn't have had to fight this hard just to prove I was telling the truth. I stood slowly, my legs shaky, and walked toward the exit. People stared at me as I passed. Some looked curious, others looked sympathetic. A few looked outright hostile, like I'd somehow cheated the system by refusing to lie down and take it. Outside the courtroom, the hallway was bright and cold. Fluorescent lights reflected off polished tile floors. People walked past in groups, lawyers and defendants and witnesses, everyone wrapped up in their own dramas. I leaned against the wall, closed my eyes, and took a long, shaky breath. I'd won. Sort of. Maybe. It wasn't over, but I'd survived this round. "Mr. Callahan?" I opened my eyes. A woman was standing in front of me, mid-30s, wearing a gray suit that looked expensive, holding a leather briefcase. She had sharp eyes and a calm, measured expression. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail. "My name is Laura Hastings," she said. "I'm an attorney. I was observing your case." I straightened up, suddenly wary. "Okay." "She thinks I need to get help," she said. "Real help. Not just a public defender." I laughed bitterly. "I can't afford a lawyer." "You can't afford not to have one," she said. "If that document is forged, and it sounds like it is, then someone committed fraud, and they're not going to go down quietly." I stared at her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this isn't over," she said. "The judge stopped the case today. That's good. But Garrett Financial isn't going to just walk away. They're going to fight. They're going to try to discredit you. They're going to make this as difficult as possible. And if you want to make sure it ends in your favor, you're going to need someone who knows how to fight back." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a business card. She held it out to me. "Think about it," she said. Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the tile floor, disappearing into the crowd of people moving through the courthouse. I looked down at the card in my hand. Laura Hastings, Esquire, Civil Litigation and Fraud Defense. There was a phone number, an email address, an office address in downtown Newark. I slipped the card into my pocket and walked toward the exit, pushing through the heavy glass doors and stepping out into the cold November air. The sky was gray. The wind was sharp. Cars moved slowly through the parking lot, their exhaust visible in the cold. I'd won the battle, but I had a feeling the war was just beginning. I didn't call Laura Hastings right away. For the first few days after the hearing, I tried to convince myself I didn't need her. The case was on hold. The investigation was happening. I just had to wait, let the system work, trust that the truth would come out on its own. But waiting turned out to be harder than I thought. 2 days after the hearing, I got a call from an unknown number. It was late afternoon. I was at the hardware store, restocking shelves in the plumbing section, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost didn't answer, but something made me step outside into the cold and pick up. "Is this Derek Callahan?" a man's voice asked. "Yeah, who's this?" "My name's Ryan Melrose. I'm calling on behalf of Garrett Financial Services." My blood went cold. I stopped walking, standing in the middle of the parking lot, my breath visible in the air. "I don't have anything to say to you," I said. "I think you do," he said calmly. His voice was smooth, professional. "Because right now, you're making things very complicated for a lot of people, and I'm calling to see if we can resolve this amicably." "Amicably?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You people forged my signature. You dragged me into court. You tried to ruin my life. And now you want to talk about being amicable?"
"Mr. Callahan," he said, his tone still smooth, unbothered, "I understand you're upset, but you need to understand something. If you push this investigation forward, it's not going to end the way you think it will." "Is that a threat?" "It's advice," he said. "You're going after a legitimate business. You're accusing people of crimes they didn't commit. And if you keep going down this road, you're going to find out how expensive legal battles can be, how exhausting, how much they take from your life." I felt my hands shaking. "I didn't start this. You did." "That's not how a jury's going to see it," he said. "They're going to see a man who borrowed money he couldn't pay back, then cried fraud when the bill came due. They're going to see someone looking for an easy way out." "Then let them," I said, "because I'm not backing down." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear faint voices in the background, the sound of an office. Then Melrose said quietly, almost gently, "You should think very carefully about what you're doing, Mr. Callahan. Goodbye." The line went dead. I stood there in the parking lot, staring at my phone, my heart pounding. A car pulled past me, the driver giving me an odd look. I barely noticed. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just sloppy paperwork or an administrative error. This was intentional. They'd forged my signature. They'd dragged me to court. And now they were trying to scare me into silence, which meant they were scared. That's when I pulled out Laura Hastings' card and called her. She met me at a diner in downtown Newark the next day. It was a small, worn-down place called Rosie's, with cracked vinyl booths, yellowing ceiling tiles, and fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. The smell of coffee and old grease hung in the air. A waitress with tired eyes brought us menus we didn't ask for. Laura ordered coffee, black. I ordered nothing, my stomach too tight to even think about food. "Tell me everything," she said, pulling out a yellow legal pad and a pen. So I did. I told her about my mother's illness, about the sleepless nights, the hospital visits, the desperate scramble for money, about the loan from Garrett, about the hearing, about the judge's reaction, about the phone call from Melrose. She listened without interrupting, taking notes in neat, precise handwriting. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me across the table. "You were right to call me," she said. "This is bigger than you think." "What do you mean?" "Garrett Financial Services isn't just some small-time lender," she said. "They operate across 3 states, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. They've been around for almost 10 years, and if they're forging documents, you're probably not the only victim." I felt a chill run down my spine. "How many others?" "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm going to find out." She leaned back in the booth, folding her arms. "Here's what's going to happen. First, I'm going to file a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office. Second, I'm going to request a full forensic audit of that loan agreement. handwriting analysis, notary verification, the works. And third, I'm going to make sure Garrett Financial knows they're being watched. And if they come after me? I asked. They already did, she said. That phone call was intimidation, classic intimidation tactics. But here's the thing. People only try to intimidate you when they're afraid. And right now, they're very afraid. I nodded slowly. What do you need from me? Everything, she said. Every document you have, every email, every phone call, every text message, every interaction with Garrett or anyone associated with him. I need a timeline. I need proof. And I need you to be ready for this to get ugly. It's already ugly, I said. She smiled faintly, a sad sort of smile. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But if we do this right, you're not just going to clear your name, you're going to take them down. I looked at her across the table. This woman I'd just met, who had no reason to believe me, who was willing to fight a battle that wasn't hers. Why are you doing this? I asked. She paused, her expression softening just slightly. She picked up her coffee cup, took a sip, then set it down carefully. Because I've seen what people like Garrett do, she said quietly. They prey on people who are vulnerable, who are desperate, who don't have the resources to fight back. And most of the time, they get away with it. They count on people being too tired, too broke, too scared to stand up.
She looked me in the eye, but not this time. Over the next 3 weeks, Laura and I worked together almost every day. She pulled records from the county clerk's office. She requested documentation from the state notary board. She interviewed witnesses. She contacted other people who had borrowed from Garrett Financial and found 6 others who had similar stories: forged signatures, falsified documents, loans that spiraled out of control with interest rates that seemed to change without notice. We built a case, not just against Garrett, but against the whole operation. One of the other victims was a woman named Rita Sandoval, a single mother from Patterson who'd borrowed money to cover her son's medical bills after a car accident. Another was an older man named Thomas Chen, who'd taken out a loan to save his restaurant during the pandemic. All of them had the same story. They'd signed one set of documents, but the contracts filed in court showed something completely different. Laura compiled everything into a detailed report, 40 pages of evidence, timelines, witness statements, and documented inconsistencies. She submitted it to the state attorney general's office with a cover letter that pulled no punches. And then we waited. 3 days later, on a cold afternoon in early December, Laura called me. I was at home, sitting on my couch, staring at the wall, when my phone rang. "Derek," she said, her voice tight with controlled excitement, "I need you to come to my office. Now." "What's going on?" "The state attorney general's office just opened a criminal investigation into Garrett Financial Services," she said, "and they want to talk to you." I felt my breath catch. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," she said. "Get here as fast as you can." I hung up, grabbed my coat, and ran out the door. The meeting with the state attorney general's office took place in a sterile conference room on the 8th floor of a government building in Trenton. The walls were beige, the carpet was gray. A long table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by uncomfortable-looking chairs. Laura sat beside me. Across from us were 2 investigators, a man named Collins, who looked like he'd spent 20 years in law enforcement, and a woman named Porter, younger, sharp-eyed, holding a tablet. Next to them sat an assistant attorney general named Simmons, a thin man in his 40s with wire-rimmed glasses and an expression that gave nothing away. They asked questions for 2 hours. They wanted every detail, every conversation, every document, every inconsistency I'd noticed. They asked me to describe Garrett's office, to recall specific things he'd said, to walk them through the timeline from the day I first contacted him to the day I received the lawsuit. I answered everything, and when I was done, Simmons leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a long moment. "Mr. Callahan," he said,
Based on what we've uncovered so far, it appears Garrett Financial Services has been operating a fraudulent lending scheme for at least 3 years. You're one of at least 12 victims we've identified, and there are likely more. I felt a strange mixture of vindication and nausea. So what happens now? Now, Simmons said, we build a case. We gather evidence. We interview witnesses. We subpoena records. And when we're ready, we bring charges. How long will that take? Laura asked. Months, Simmons admitted. Maybe longer. These cases are complicated. Financial fraud cases take time to build properly. But I can tell you this, we're going to pursue this aggressively. He looked at me. Mr. Callahan, you did the right thing. A lot of people in your position would have just walked away, paid the settlement, moved on. You didn't. And because of that, you may have saved other people from going through what you went through. I nodded, but I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt tired. Collins leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table. One more thing, he said. If Garrett or anyone associated with him contacts you again, and they probably will, don't engage. Document it. Record it if you can, but don't respond. Let us handle it. Understood, I said. Porter slid a business card across the table. Call us if anything happens, day or night. We left the building an hour later. Outside, the December wind was brutal, cutting through my coat like it wasn't even there. Laura and I stood on the sidewalk, watching traffic move past.
"You okay?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "I feel like I should feel better, but I just feel empty." She nodded. "That's normal. You've been running on adrenaline for weeks. Now that things are moving, your body's crashing." "What happens next?" I asked. "We wait," she said. "The AG's office will do their job. We've done ours. Now it's up to them." The criminal case against Garrett Financial Services took 8 months to build. During that time, I went back to work. I tried to rebuild my life. I picked up extra shifts. I paid my rent. I ate. I slept. I went through the motions. But the weight of it all never really left me. I thought about my mother constantly, about the bills I'd taken on to give her a chance, about how Garrett had turned my grief into a weapon, about how close I'd come to losing everything because I'd tried to do the right thing. And I thought about the judge who had mocked me in that courtroom, who had dismissed me, who had almost let them win. In August, Garrett and 2 of his associates were indicted on multiple counts of fraud, forgery, racketeering, and conspiracy. The case made local news. I saw Garrett's face on TV being led out of his office in handcuffs. He looked smaller than I remembered. Older. Laura called me the day the indictment was announced. "You did it," she said. "We did it," I corrected. She laughed softly. "Yeah, we did." The trial lasted 3 weeks. I testified on the 5th day. I sat in the witness box and told my story, all of it. The prosecutor asked questions. Garrett's defense attorney tried to discredit me, to make me look like a liar or a deadbeat. But the evidence was overwhelming. Forged signatures, fake notaries, falsified loan agreements, a pattern of predatory behavior that stretched back years. 5 other victims testified. Rita Sandoval cried on the stand. Thomas Chen's hands shook when he spoke, but they all told the truth. The jury convicted Garrett on all counts. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. His 2 associates got 6 years each. When the sentence was read, I sat in the back of the courtroom and felt nothing. Not relief, not satisfaction, not joy, just emptiness. Because none of it brought my mother back. None of it erased the months I'd spent terrified and humiliated. None of it gave me back the version of myself that existed before all of this started. Justice had been served, but it didn't feel the way I thought it would. After the sentencing, Laura and I stood outside the courthouse. It was a warm September afternoon. The sky was clear and blue. People walked past, going about their lives, completely unaware of what had just happened inside. "How do you feel?" she asked. I thought about it for a long time. Then I said, "I feel like I survived something I shouldn't have had to survive." She nodded. "That's fair."
We stood there in silence for a moment, watching the world move around us. Then she said, "What are you going to do now?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I guess I just move forward." "That's all any of us can do," she said. She shook my hand, gave me a small, sad smile, and walked away. I watched her go. Then I turned and walked in the opposite direction, back toward my car, back toward whatever came next. I'd fought. I'd won. But the victory felt heavier than I'd expected. Because justice, I realized, doesn't erase the damage. It just stops it from happening to someone else. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that had to be enough. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove home through the late summer heat. The fight was over, but the weight of it would stay with me for the rest of my life. I thought about my mother as I drove, about her voice, about the way she'd smiled when I brought her flowers in the hospital, about the last words she'd said to me, "You're a good son, Derek."
I hoped she was right. I hoped that somewhere, somehow, she knew I'd done everything I could, and I hoped that was enough.